Okay, so just double checking. This is managerial accounting, right? Okay. So we are, as Audrey pointed out, we are discussing process costing this week. And you might remember last week was job order costing, right? So you're going to see some similarities, but definitely some differences here. We will start with a review of what are these two different costing methods that we have addressed so far, job order and process costing, and what are the characteristics of each one. Now, conversion costs play a very important role in process costing. The tricky part about this chapter is dealing with something called equivalent units for conversion. Okay, it's a new concept for you. It takes a little getting used to, so you really want to pay attention when we're talking about equivalent units for conversion, because that is the hardest part of the chapter, I believe. We will be able to then calculate the cost of production, both the cost of what has been completed, but also the cost of what's still in process. And in process costing, we have to keep track of those costs for each department. So then we transfer costs when they move from one department to the next. So like I said, it's got some differences compared to last week. So we'll learn how to calculate those costs for a department that's transferring costs out, but also for other departments that might be transferring costs in. So we'll learn how that all works, and we'll learn the journal entries associated with this process. Okay. All right, so let's review when you would use process costing and when you would use job order costing. So for last week, when we were talking about job order costing, what were the scenarios where it would make sense to use that type of costing?
Like on custom orders?
Custom orders, yes. Any other situations? If you're producing in small batches, you're going to make 10 of something or 100 of something, you could count that as a job. Process costing is used when you're mass producing, right? So if you just keep making the same thing over and over and you're making thousands or millions of the same thing, then that job order costing approach wouldn't really make sense. And process costing would make more sense. Okay? So when you have a standardized production process that just keeps going for a long period of time. So let's do a comparison here between the two. With process costing, as I mentioned earlier, we have to keep track of the costs in each department. If you remember, with job order costing, there was a job order sheet, and all of the costs associated with that job went onto that one sheet, regardless of what department they came from. And then by the end of the job, you had a sheet that had all the material, all the labor, and all the overhead documented in one place. And similarly, in the accounting records, there would be a work in process account with all of those costs for that job in that one work in process account. But in process costing, it's different. We keep track of the costs by department. Okay, so you've got costs starting. Where do they start in the production process? What are the very first costs involved? The raw materials, right? So we take the raw materials out of the storeroom or the warehouse, put them into production. So that's a cost already, right? Cost of those materials. Then we add what? Okay, but what does that involve? What kind of costs?
Direct labor.
We have direct labor. We have overhead. And maybe even more materials that we need to add to the units we're already producing. And as we do that, the units that are in production might be going from department to department. So we have to keep track of those costs that keep getting added within each department until you finally get to your finished goods and you can see the entire cost. But the reason it's done that way is every department wants to know their costs. They want to know how much material did we put in? How much labor and overhead did we contribute? Well, maybe overhead, maybe not always, but at least the material and the labor, they want to know what portion of the costs were for a particular department. Okay, so let's see. There's one work in process account per process. So that means you've got, let's say you have 3 different departments that are going to be working on this product. Each one would have their own work in process account. Okay, so the process costing, we don't have a work in process account for the job, it's for each process involved in production. We know it's for large batches or continuous production. As I mentioned, there's this new concept of equivalent units. Right? So I'll explain that when the time comes. And we have to keep track of the costs that got transferred in and the costs that get transferred out to other departments. All right. Then with job order costing, thinking back to last week, we track the cost for each job. That would be each client or each custom product we're making. There was one work in process account per job. And we use this again for small batches and custom orders. We didn't have to worry about this equivalent unit concept. That didn't come up. And each department tracks its expenses and then they get added to the job cost sheet and the work in process account for that particular job. Okay. And then that sheet just moves from department to department. So again, pretty different approaches from last week. What do you think? These cookies, would their costs have been tracked using job order costing or process costing?
Process.
How many people say process costing? Right. How many people say job order costing? Okay. Good for you, Jan. You stood out and you were different. And you're not wrong, but the others of you are not necessarily wrong either. So why did you say job order costing? Right? Because
Maybe different flavors.
okay, so there might be small batches of different flavors of cookies. These don't really look like the mass-produced Nabisco type of cookies that they make by the millions. These might even be homemade. We don't really know. So I don't think we have enough information to know how large are the batches. Were these custom orders? It doesn't look like it, but who knows? So did you have something to say?
Just in the bottom says home baked.
Home baked? Okay, that's you're right. Hey, very good attention to detail. Yeah, so maybe job order costing might be appropriate if you're doing it in small batches at home. So let's look at an example that would be process costing. You know, everybody's probably familiar with Nabisco. They make Oreos and lots of other cookies. So they make cookies by the millions, right? That would definitely be a situation where you'd use job order costing. And look at all the different departments that might be involved. So you might have one department that actually makes the dough. They take the different ingredients and they mix them together, but then you have another department that molds the dough into the right shape. And then you bake the dough, right? And it turns into a cookie. And then, like, if these are Oreos, you know, they've got filling between the two cookies. So that could be a separate department. Well, actually, one department putting the filling on, another one that assembles the cookies together. And then somebody else packages them up. Those could each be a different department. And if they are, then you would want to track the costs for each department because every department manager or supervisor wants to know what their costs are, right? So they can evaluate their performance. Any questions or comments so far?
Travis, when you say department on that, can it also just be the machine process?
Could be, yeah, it depends how automated it is, and you might have departments that do multiple tasks. But for now, just think in terms of every process is its own department.
Okay.
Just for simplicity's sake. All right, so here we see where production fits into everything. We know that a lot of the costs of companies are administrative in nature. Those are the period costs we've learned about because they don't relate to production. And then you've got the manufacturing side of things. That's where your production costs are, right? Although shipping we know is not a production cost, it might be part of the manufacturing part of the company, but those costs are actually not part of production. And in production, well, we've got the materials part. And then in this particular example we're going to go through, we've got two production departments. This is actually not for cookies, though. This is a company that makes drumsticks for drummers. So they've got a materials storeroom that receives the wood that they then shape in the shaping department. And then they've got a packaging department that, since people usually buy drumsticks in pairs, they probably wrap up pairs of drumsticks together, maybe with shrink wrap or a ribbon or something. Maybe they put a price label on there. So they do the packaging in the packaging department, okay? So in this scenario, we've got really two departments involved in producing the product. Shaping, packaging, okay? So we're going to go through an example where we'll see how those costs could be calculated for each department and then transferred to the next department. All right. So we would start with the raw materials. Shaping department takes those raw materials and they convert them, right? They add their labor and overhead to turn them into drumsticks. Then the packaging department takes those finished drumsticks, but they're not considered a finished product yet because they have to be packaged. So again, they might shrink wrap those drumsticks, and if they do that, that requires some shrink wrapping material. Or maybe they put them in a little cardboard box. That would be material as well. So the packaging department will be adding its own material, labor, overhead to this process. And then it becomes a finished good. So the costs start here, right? We start with some material costs. We add some conversion costs here, transfer all of those costs out, and add some more conversion costs and some material costs, transfer all of that out to finished goods. Okay, so that's the way we need to think in this department, is we keep adding costs and transferring them to the next place. Any questions so far? Okay, this is review, right? We know what prime costs are. We know what conversion costs are. It's easy to keep track of the material costs. If we took enough wood out of the storeroom to make 1,000 drumsticks, that's 1,000 units worth of materials. And that's not going to change. We might add some other materials like the shrink wrap, but we know we're working with 1,000 units of materials. Okay, that's pretty easy to track. It just moves through the whole process. But the conversion costs, a little trickier, because let's say the shaping department starts making 1,000 units of drumsticks, and at the end of the month, they've only made 800. So they could then transfer those 800 to the next department, but they've got 200 that are still in process. So that's where you have to start separating what's completed and transferred out, and what's still in process. And the ones that are in process might not be completely converted, right? Because if they were completely converted, they'd be done. So maybe they're 20% converted, or 50%, or 70%. And that's where we get into that concept of equivalent units of conversion that I said is the trickiest part of this whole chapter. One way to think of it, imagine you have a party and you order pizza. You've probably experienced this before. You start off with a whole bunch of pizza boxes, and one by one, some of those pizza boxes are now empty, and people are flipping through them to try to find which ones have pizza. So then you consolidate them, right? You ever had that experience? Oh, let's get rid of some of these empty boxes. Let's consolidate. And so you take the one slice out of this box, the two slices out of that box, etc., and you find that that these four partial pizzas make up one whole pizza, maybe with different types, right? But you can fit them now. Now you've consolidated it down into just two boxes. So instead of four partial boxes of one full box that maybe, I don't know, maybe it had anchovies and nobody liked that, instead of four partial and one complete, you can consolidate it down to the equivalent of two complete boxes. And that's really what we have to do with this equivalent units concept, is say, okay, at the end of the month, we have 200 units that are still in process, and they're only 50% done. So we'll call that 100 units that are completely done, even though they're not, right? You take the number of units that are in process and multiply it by how done they are as a percentage, and that is how you get your equivalent units for conversion. Okay. So we will be working with that quite a bit today. Any questions? So we know what conversion costs are, right? It's the labor and the overhead that go into converting that material into a finished product. Right? I mentioned that we start off with some materials at the beginning of the production process. That tells us how many units we're producing, but you can add more materials later. So like I mentioned with the drumstick example, if you start off with enough wood to make 1,000 drumsticks, that whole batch is 1,000 drumsticks, right? That doesn't change. And if you add more materials, that adds to your material cost, but you're still working on 1,000 drumsticks. If you went and got more wood, you wouldn't just add it to that previous batch. You would start a new batch, okay? So when we add material costs, we're not increasing the number of units. We're just adding, again, like the shrink wrap or the cardboard box or some other material cost that does not increase the number of units. Now, conversion costs, it's kind of hard to say exactly when they occur. That's why at the end of the period, we have to figure out what our equivalent units of conversion are. Because labor is something that gets added all the time, right? Every day, your workers are adding more labor costs. And overhead, we apply it at certain points, but the electricity, the insurance, the rent, these are ongoing costs, right? So what we have to do at certain points is figure out what those conversion costs are, and then how much to apply for the work that's been done. Okay, so here's a 4-step process. You have to figure out how many units we're working with. What are the equivalent units of production? So going back to my same example, we take 1,000 units of wood. So 1,000, enough wood to make 1,000 pairs of drumsticks. Okay. Say it like that. So we know we're making 1,000 pairs of drumsticks, but then at the end of the period, how converted are the ones that are still in process, right? We have to figure out, as I mentioned, what are the equivalent units of conversion. Once we've done that, then we can figure out the cost per equivalent unit. I'm going to show you how to do this. And then we can figure out the cost of what we've completed and the cost of what is still in process. It's a multi-step process. You're definitely going to want to take good notes about the steps because there will be some problems that you'll be doing on your own where you're going to have to go step by step. And there's a table that you'll see that we use that is very helpful, but it's not super clear on what you have to do. So you have to know how to use that table to go through all these steps. Okay, so let me give you an example here. Again, this is still the drumstick company. So the shaping department, which is the one that takes the raw material and shapes it into drumsticks, they started 8,700 pairs of drumsticks. Okay. That is the batch that they're working on. At the end of the period, they have completed 7,500 pairs. So then how many pairs are still in process? 1,200, right? The difference. Now, at the end of the period, the question is, how complete are they? And here it tells us the ones, those 1,200 that are still in process are 35% complete. Now, that might mean that 35% of them are done, but they're still part of this group, so they just haven't been transferred yet. Or it could mean that all 1,200 of them are 35% done. It really doesn't matter. Somehow the people in production came up with this 35% number. Maybe it was a guess, maybe they had some way to determine it. It doesn't really matter. All we need to know is how far along the conversion is for those units that are still in process. And the answer here is they're 35% complete. Great. From an accounting perspective, that is what we needed to know. We see what are the costs. We've got some direct material costs for this period, some direct labor, and some manufacturing overhead. But what we don't know is how much of these costs apply to the 7,500 units that are complete, and how much to apply to the 1,200 that are still in process. Okay, and that's why we have to go through this multi-step process to figure it out. So we need to find the cost of the inventory that was complete, because the products that are, well, actually, the products that we finish in the shaping department go to the next department, the packaging department, right? So we need to transfer those costs out. But the ones that are still in process, those costs stay in our department until those units are done. So those would be still work in process in the shaping department. Okay, so this is the process. We're going through it like slowly, step by step here. But the way we're actually going to apply it in the exercise and problem sets is, like I said, it's going to use a very complex table that you'll get used to working with. But for now, it's a little easier just to go through it step by step. Now, you always have to first start with units, and later you get to costs, okay? So the first half of the process is figuring out how many units are complete and how many units are in process, and what is the equivalent units in terms of conversion. Once you know that, then you can move on and figure out the costs. So the very beginning here, notice we've got these two tables. One says units to account for, and the other says units accounted for, right? Well, the total units to account for and the total units to account for, actually it's the same thing. Don't worry if it says accounted for or to account for, it's basically the same thing, okay? And it's the same number, 8,700, 8,700. Okay, we'll see that many times that understanding these two simple formulas and the relationship is really important. If you take the beginning units that are in work in process and then add any new ones that you started making during the period, that is the total units to account for. So at the beginning of the period, they weren't making any drumsticks. They started making 8,700 pairs. And so that is the total. 8,700 pairs is the total that they needed to account for this period. Now compare that down here. They completed 7,500 units. They still have 1,200 in process, and that also equals 8,700. So it's really two ways of looking at the same thing. Okay. One is starting with the beginning inventory, and the other one includes the ending inventory. So as you can imagine, there will be cases where there will be a missing number, but because you understand the relationships of these two formulas, you'll be able to find the missing number, right? Like if we didn't, like earlier, Emma said 1,200 was how many units were in process. How did she know that? She took the total minus what was completed to come up with the difference. Okay. Anything need clarification at this point? Okay. Don't be too worried about these letters here. If you want to see how they later relate to the results, those letters could be useful, but I think it's easier if we just walk through it. What you'll notice over here, we've got three columns. There's a total column, there's a material column, and there's a conversion column. Is there any difference between the total column and the material column? No, and there won't be. Those are always the same. Okay? Because remember when I said that when you take 1,000 units worth of wood, make 1,000 drumsticks, that batch is always going to be 1,000 drumsticks that you're making, right? So your total units that you're making and the material units are always going to be the same. Now, another thing I want to point out, this row here, completed and transferred out. In the shaping department, if we have transferred 7,500 drumsticks or pairs of drumsticks to the next department, do they need to be fully converted as far as our department is concerned?
Yeah.
Yeah. They need to be done, right? All the labor, all the overhead that this department is going to contribute has to already have been done. So you're always going to see the completed and transferred out is going to be the same number in all three columns. Okay, so that kind of makes it easy. These two columns are always the same, and this row, it's always the same number all the way across. The only weird part is when you get into the equivalent units of conversion. You remember how those 1,200 units that were still in process were only 35% complete? So what we have to do is multiply the number of units that are in process times how complete they are, and that gets us our equivalent units for conversion. So those 1,200 drumsticks, or pairs of drumsticks, are the equivalent of 420 pairs of drumsticks that have been converted. Just like the two pizzas were the equivalent of the 5 combined pizzas, right? Okay. And the reason we need to have that number, that equivalent units for conversion, is so that we can add it to the ones that were completely converted, get a total, and use that to figure out the conversion cost per unit. We wouldn't be able to figure that out if we didn't know the equivalent units for conversion. Okay, so that's what we're going to be spending more time on in this chapter than anything else, is that one concept. Are there any questions at this point?
It's always gonna be to figure out the conversion costs.
Yep, you're always going to take how many units are in process, which we see here will be the same number under total materials. You just take that number, multiply it by the percentage that's given to you in the instructions for that exercise or problem, and that will get you the number.
And they're always gonna give us the conversion amount.
Yeah, they'll always give us the conversion percentage. Sometimes to throw us off, they will also tell us the conversion percentage for beginning inventory. We never need that information, just ignore it. It's always the ending inventory conversion percentage that we need. But yeah, it's always given to us. All right, any other questions? Okay. So now that we have figured that out and we have the total equivalent units for materials and for conversion, we can take these numbers. See how it's the same numbers here. We have equivalent units for materials and conversion, right? And we divide that number into the material costs and the conversion costs to get a cost per unit for materials and for conversion. So that part's not as challenging. Then you can add them together and you get a total cost per unit. Okay, so now we can take those costs per unit and figure out the cost of everything that got transferred out. We transferred out 7,500 units, right? So 7,500 units times the material cost per unit plus 7,500 units times the conversion cost per unit gives us a total cost of what got transferred out to the next department. However, for work in process, we can't do it exactly that way because the number of equivalent units is different and the price per unit is different. So we have to multiply each of those separately. So we get a total material cost for what's still in process, total conversion cost for what's in process. Add them together, get our total work in process, add that to what got transferred out, and we get the total cost. Okay, so it is, again, a multi-step process. But most of it, I think, pretty much makes sense. It's just that equivalent units part that takes some getting used to. Let me ask you something. If we go back to calculating the cost of what got completed and transferred out, right? As I said, we took the 7,500 units times the material cost per unit plus 7,500 units times the conversion cost per unit. Would there have been a simpler way to do that?
Yeah.
What could we have done?
You could just divide it by
Exactly. We could have just multiplied, since it's 7,500 in both cases, and it always will be when we're talking about what got transferred out. Remember, they always all have to be converted. So you're gonna have the same number under materials that you have under conversion. You could just take that one number and add it to, or multiply it by the total cost per unit, right? Material cost per unit plus the conversion cost per unit gives you a total cost per unit. Multiply that by the number of units that got transferred out, and you'll get the same number. Okay. How are we doing so far?
Travis, this is the table that you were talking about, that we need.
Sort of, yeah. It is, it's just formatted a little different. Okay, all right, so here, this is the table. Let me make it a little bigger for you. So I'll just walk you through. I know it might look a little overwhelming. But if you take it one little part at a time, you'll see that it all kind of makes sense. And really, it is the same thing we just walked through. So here we can see that at the beginning of the period, there was nothing in work in process. And they started making 8,700 units of drumsticks. So they had a total of 8,700 units of drumsticks to account for. Okay, now the materials are always 100% complete. It's like I said, you take 8,700 units worth of materials, you've got 8,700 units of materials all the way through the process. That does not change. So don't worry, you're always going to see 100% completion for materials in terms of the cost. Because, well, I shouldn't say cost, in terms of the units. But the conversion depends. So when we get into the work in process, ending inventory, the part that has not been finished by the end of the period, that's where we have to rely on the production folks to tell us how complete are these units. And they give us a percentage, right? So in this case, it was 35%. Now, this was one formula, 0 plus 8,700 equals 8,700. And here we see the other formula, 7,500 plus 1,200 equals 8,700. Remember, those two formulas will always have the same answer. The units to account for. So here, what we see is 7,500 units are complete, 1,200 are in process. As I mentioned, the materials column is always the same as the total column. Sometimes they get moved around. They're not necessarily in the same order, but they're always the same information, and regardless of where they are on the page. And that top column is always the same all the way across, right? The units that got completed and transferred out had to all be converted. Then we got our little problem child here, which again is the number of units that are in process times the percentage of completion, right? So because these 1,200 units were only 35% complete, we count that as the equivalent of 420 units. We need a number. And then we can add that equivalent units for conversion to the 7,500 that were completely converted to get our total equivalent units for conversion. Okay. Everybody following along, kind of, sort of? Okay. So now that top part all dealt with units, now we can get into costs. So if we take our material costs and figure out our total material costs, divide it by the equivalent units, we get our material cost per unit. Same thing, if we take our total conversion costs, divide it by the equivalent units of conversion, we get our conversion cost per unit. And then we add these two numbers together to get our total cost per unit. Now, if you said, okay, we've got 8,700 equivalent units for conversion in the total column, so let's divide that into our total cost. Don't do that. It's not going to give you this number, okay? So in this case, that's why that's left blank, because we just don't even need that information in there. In some cases, in the exercise set and problem set, you'll see this 8,700 or whatever the equivalent units is under materials, you'll see it also under total. And so you might make the mistake of dividing to get your total cost, but that would give you the wrong answer. So don't do that.
Close though,
What's that?
it's close though, it's not like.
Well, yeah,
But,
yeah. And the reason it's not correct is because we're not completely converted. So that's what throws the number off. So the only way to get your total cost per unit is to add up the material cost and conversion cost per unit. Okay. And then once you know those costs per unit, then you can figure out the cost of what's still in process, the cost of what got transferred out, and then you can add those together to get your total cost. Now remember, the cost of what got transferred out, well, let's just think about that. Let me ask you, how would we calculate the cost of materials for what got transferred out? Okay, exactly. So we would look at 7,500 units of materials times the material cost per unit. And that's completed and transferred. We could then take the ending work in process material units, also multiply by the equivalent cost per unit for materials, and that gives us our ending work in process material cost. Okay, time consuming, not that hard. About conversion, let's see, how would we get this $21,000 of conversion costs for what got completed and transferred out?
And you multiply the total by the conversion.
Okay, can you be more specific?
I don't know if it's the partial or the second, I think it's the same number, the total number, right?
Yeah.
7,000.
The 7,500. So since we're looking at completed and transferred, right? We want to know what got completed and transferred out. We would look at completed and transferred out up here. 7,500 units times the $2.80 conversion cost per unit is how we get that. So then how would we get the conversion cost for what's still in process? The 420?
Yeah.
Okay. So we would take this 420 equivalent units for conversion, also multiply it by the $2.80 conversion cost per unit. And that's how we get it. Okay. It's not the most user-friendly table. You have to kind of jump around a little bit. You'll get the hang of it. Any clarification needed? Wow. I think that's the same. Yeah, this just shows you all those previous steps and where they relate, but I don't think we need to go through that. You can study that and meditate on it on your own and see what you figure out. Oh, good. Okay, an exercise. Let's do that. So go ahead, open up your exercise set. And we'll take a look at this one. Right, so in this exercise, it looks like we're dealing, oh, let's see. Oh, we are dealing with costs. Okay. All right. Okay, company started a new product. In the first month, they started 100,000 units. So they started making 100,000 units. The ending work in process inventory was 20,000 units. Now, notice it says that we're 100% complete with materials. Again, it's always going to be 100% complete in terms of materials. So just ignore that. What we do need to know is 75% complete with conversion costs. Okay, that's important. There were 100,000 units to account for. Well, that makes sense, right? Because they started with 0 units. It's a brand new company, or at least it's a new product. So they started with 0, started making 100,000. So that's a total of 100,000 that they have to work with, right? So that's kind of a given. The material cost is $6 per unit. The conversion cost, they're giving that to us. It's $8 per unit. So what we need to figure out, what is the value of the inventory that got transferred out? Okay, so what we'll have to do,
It's using the weighted average.
yeah, so what we have to do is figure out what are the units that got transferred out? What is the cost per unit that got transferred? That's a total cost per unit. And then we'll be able to multiply to get our cost, okay? So we need units, we need cost per unit, and then we'll multiply. I'll give you a minute or two to work on that. And you all didn't remind me. So that is our answer, $1,120,000. Okay, and we needed to know how many units got completed and transferred out, what was the cost per unit, multiply, and we get the total cost of what got transferred out of one department and into the next department. Any questions? You might be wondering what happens then. Well, that next department is going to add their own costs, right? Their own labor, overhead, materials perhaps. And the total, what got transferred in and what they're transferring out, you know, it all goes into the next department, right? So the costs just keep increasing and increasing because it's cumulative until it gets to the finished goods, at which point that's the final cost. Is there a question, Jordan?
Yeah, so we don't do anything with the, where it says 75% complete with conversion costs?
In this case, we actually did not need that. That's right, because they already told us the conversion cost per unit. But if we'd had to figure that out on our own, then we would have needed it. And you are correct. Okay, anything else? Let's see what's next.
Oh, so that's how they got the 6 from the 8. Is it, you just multiply it by 75%?
This is the math.
Is that it?
It's probably just happened to come out that way. Okay, let's take a look at this one together and work through it. You know what? Let me put it in a Word document. It'll be easier to see. Okay. We have some similar numbers here, but it's a different example. So this company's making 8,700 cans of paint. 7,500 are complete. So it tells us 1,200 are still in process, right? Everybody agree? Okay. They give us the direct material cost, the labor cost, and the overhead cost. How would we figure out the conversion costs?
Just adding your overhead and your
Yeah, just adding your direct labor and your overhead gives you your conversion costs, okay? And what we don't know is how much of those costs apply to what's completed and how much applies to what's still in process, right? That's the tricky part. Okay, and then the conversion is 30% complete. what is the cost of the inventory that's been transferred out and the work in process? Let's see if in this little space we have here on the screen, let's see if we can just figure this out somehow. All right. So we know we have 8,700 total units. Right? Total. We know we have 7,500 units complete. And we know we have 1,200 units in process, right? Okay, so I'll just put that there for reference. What is, well, we have the direct material cost. That's pretty simple. Let's figure out what those conversion costs are. As Robert said, we can take the labor and the overhead. If we add those together, we get $26,970. Okay. We also see that the units that are in process are 30% complete in terms of conversion. Okay. So what would be the equivalent units of conversion in this scenario? 360 is right. And how'd you get that, Emma? Okay. So the 30% completion times the 1,200 units in process. So I'm going to add here 360 equivalent units for conversion. Okay. So that's the material, that's the information we really need to work with here. So the questions are the cost of the inventory that got transferred out, and the in-process costs, right? The ones that are still in process, what are those costs? So let's just focus in on this information. We'll start with cost of what got transferred out. How would we figure that out?
Subtract the total units from the completions from the process.
Say that again, Jordan.
It's just the units complete, right?
Well, now we're trying to figure out costs. So we know how many units we're dealing with. The ones that got transferred out are the ones that are complete, right? Because that's when you can transfer it, is when it's complete. So we know it's 7,500 units, but how much of the costs were for those 7,500 units?
You divide the cost of direct materials by the complete units, conversion cost by the complete units.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're going to have to do is take our direct material costs, divide it by the 70, divide it by the, you might have said that right, but divide it by the total number of units. Okay, because we know for materials, we're dealing with 8,700 units of materials. Let's go ahead and break this down into two separate lines here. If we take our total cost for materials divided by the 8,700 units, the $1.19, Emma says, that means our material cost is $1.19 per unit. Right? And we can do something similar here with conversion costs, but it's a little different. What are the total equivalent units for conversion? Yes, that's right, 7,860. So for materials, we were able to just look at the total number of units. But for conversion, we have to take the completed units plus the equivalent units for conversion, right? We can't count all 1,200 because they're not completely converted. We have to take the numbers that are complete plus the equivalent units for conversion that we calculated. And as Emma said, that's going to be 7,860 units. So then when we divide 343, does that look right? So our conversion cost came out to 343 per unit. Okay. Any questions there? I know that's the tricky part, but anything need clarification? So then to apply that to what got transferred out, what do?
Multiply it by the units complete.
Multiply it by what?
The units complete.
Okay. So there's 7,500 units complete, and then what do we multiply by that number?
1.19.
Well, we can actually add the 1.19 to the $3.43, right? Because that's going to be the total cost for the material and conversion combined. We could do it separately. We could have multiplied each of these costs by 7,500 and then added them together. But instead, we could just add these together first. We get a total cost of $4.62 per unit. That includes the materials and the conversion, and then multiply it by the 7,500 units that were completed. But then to figure out the cost of what's still in process, how do we do that?
By the conversion cost.
So basically, remember though, for material purposes, we have 1,200 units in process. For conversion purposes, because they're only 30% complete, we have 360 units in process in terms of conversion. So what we have to do is multiply each of those separately by the corresponding costs. So we'll take 1,200 units of materials in process times $1.19. $1,428. But we also have to take 360 units for conversion times 343 conversion cost per unit. $1,234.80. And we can add those together. We get a total $2,662.80. Okay, I hope I did that all right. This one was really just for us to practice. So those are the steps. Okay, in this case, it wasn't laid out in that table, and maybe it was a little harder to follow. So you'll see that the table actually is your friend once you get used to using it. But we really did the same thing that we would have done in the table. All right, any questions? No? All right, so then, all right, so we've already gone through the process of how you figure out the costs that are for what got completed and the costs that are for what are still in process, right? What we haven't really done is looked at when those costs get transferred from one department to another. Okay, so let me walk back over here and we will talk about that. Okay. I'm recording, right? I think so, yeah. Okay. So I guess this is back to a cookie example. We've got a mixing department and then the packaging. Oh no, paint. That makes more sense. Cookies, you'd have to cook, right? This would be paint. So they mix the paint and then they package the paint. Okay. So here we've got the mixing department. At the beginning of the period, they had 0 work in process inventory. They added some material costs. They added some conversion costs. And then for those completed units, the costs get transferred out to the next department. This packaging department, they're gonna have their own labor costs, conversion costs, and material costs. They have the cost of the actual cans, right? That's gonna be a material cost. So they will add those costs onto what got transferred in. And then whatever they've completed, all those costs then get transferred out to finished goods. Okay? All right, back to the drumsticks. What happens in the packaging department? So remember the 7,500 units of drumsticks that got completed. And they got transferred out of the shaping department into the packaging department. And so those costs get transferred into that department. Then it looks like they're adding more of their own costs. So that department, okay, this is now, it's the same company, same products, but now we're looking at the data for a separate department. So in the packaging department, they had 750 units of drumsticks that they were already working on at the beginning of the period. So those were units they didn't finish last period. And the 7,500 just got transferred in. So now they've got 8,250 to account for. That's the total number of units they're working on. Now, during the period, they finished 6,500. So they were completely packaged and ready to be sold, leaving 1,750 units still in process because they're not quite packaged and ready to be sold. Okay, make sense? And again, total units to account for matches. Okay, then again, we see our columns. Total and materials are exactly the same as they always are. The units that got completed and transferred out from this packaging department was 6,500. And again, it's the same number all the way across, right? They had to be completely converted, completely packaged to then get transferred out, right? But there were they were only 40% complete with the ones that were still in process. So out of the 1,750 that they hadn't finished at the end of the month, that group was 40% complete. So we're calling that the equivalent of 700 units. So it's the same concept we already learned, right? Take the number of units in process times the percentage of completion for conversion. And then you just add that to the completely converted units, and you get your total equivalent units for conversion, right? Which you need to figure out the cost per unit for conversion. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. All right, now, the costs. At the beginning of the period, they had some, remember they had some that they hadn't finished from the last period, right? So they already had some material costs and conversion costs that carried over from the last period, and they're sitting there in their work in process inventory. But then they added more materials and more conversion costs. Now let's take a look at that. If you see down here, the material costs that got added, some of them are the ones that got transferred in from the shaping department, right? Those were material costs that got transferred in, but they added their own material costs too. The shrink wrapping and the cardboard boxes and the price labels and whatever else, whatever other materials they added. So you have to keep that in mind. If you're not the first department, you're not only getting costs transferred into you, but you're also adding your own costs to that. Same thing with conversion. There were $21,000 of conversion costs that got transferred in with that batch that came in from the shaping department, but this department is adding its own conversion costs, right? Its own labor and overhead. So if we take the beginning costs for whatever was in process at the beginning of the period, add what got transferred in and the costs from within the department, we get our total costs. Then we divide by the total number of units, which for materials is this 8,250, right? But for conversion, it's less, right? Because some of the units are not converted yet. So our equivalent units for conversion in work in process came out to 700. Our total equivalent units for conversion came out to what, 7,200. That is what gets divided here into the total conversion costs to get our conversion cost per unit, right? That's how this process works. And then how do we get this total cost per unit? Add the material plus conversion to get the total. Okay. Then with those costs per unit, that's where we can then apply it. If the packaging department completely packaged and transferred out 6,500 units, and multiply that number by the material cost per unit, by the conversion cost per unit, and get your total cost per unit, or total cost, right? For what got transferred out. However, for your ending work in process, you have to do those separately. The equivalent units for materials times the material cost per unit, the equivalent units for conversion times the conversion cost per unit. We add those two numbers together to get our total work in process. Okay. I know we've kind of already gone through this process 3 or 4 times, but again, this is the most difficult part of this whole chapter. So that's why I want to make sure you have plenty of opportunity to think it through and understand it. All right, let's see what this is. Exercise number 4. Okay, this is only dealing with units, so we're not going to get into costs on this one at all. Okay, good. All right, so there were 1,700 units in beginning inventory. Now here's one of those cases that were 40% complete. It's talking about beginning inventory. Again, we don't care how complete the beginning inventory is. Just ignore that percentage. During the month, 8,550 units were started. 9,000 were transferred out. The ending work in process was 60% complete. That's the part that we care about when we figure out equivalent units of conversion, the ending work in process. Okay. And then we have to figure out the total amount of equivalent units for materials and conversion. The equivalent units for materials and conversion at the end of the month. Okay. So I think you can do this. I have confidence in you. So we're gonna start here by filling in what you know. Beginning inventory, how many units they started. That'll give you total units to account for. And remember that that is going to match units accounted for here, right? This is your total column, even though it doesn't say total, I'll just write it right there if I can, total. Okay. Remember that the total column is going to match the materials column. Remember that this row is going to be the same number all the way across. And really the tricky part is going to be right here, figuring out your equivalent units for conversion, and then adding that to get your total equivalent units for conversion, okay? So any questions on what you need to do here? All right, well then go ahead and take a couple minutes and do it. Okay, yeah, beginning inventory.
1300.
Okay, started in production. Okay, and so then what is our units to account for?
10,000.
1,250, okay, which again will be the same as units accounted for. How many units did we transfer out? So what is our ending inventory?
1,250.
Yeah, exactly. We can just find the difference, right? Because they didn't tell us ending inventory, right? So we had to subtract what got transferred out from the total units to account for, figure that out. And then materials column is going to be the same. Conversion transferred out is going to match the other columns, right? So it's the same number all the way across. And then what is our ending inventory equivalent units for conversion? 750? Okay. How'd you get that, Emma?
Well, times 60%.
Exactly, the 1,250 that were in process still times the 60% completion. And then what is our units accounted for? 9750? Is that right? Okay. So that's how we do it. Again, I think that's the hardest part of the whole chapter. So if you're starting to get the hang of it, congratulations. And we did get the right number there. Any questions? No? All right. What is next here? Oh, wow, we are making really good progress. Well, there's another exercise, okay? Yeah, we still have some time, so let's go ahead and go to exercise 14. Okay. Production department within a company received materials of $10,000 and they received conversion costs of $10,000. So these are getting transferred in from a prior department. Okay. Then that department added its own material costs and some conversion costs. Equivalent units were already calculated for us. It's 20,000 for material, 18,000 for conversion. In fact, equivalent units, we can just put those in here already. Make it easy. So really what you're going to need to do here is figure out what is the total material cost, including both what got transferred in and what the department added on its own. We'll do the same thing with conversion costs. And then you'll calculate the per unit material and conversion costs. Okay? In other words, fill in this column and then fill in that column. Any questions? Okay, go ahead and. Okay, so we take the conversion costs to thought. Thank you. Okay. Divide by the equivalent units for conversion, we get $3.50 per unit. Okay. It wasn't that hard, right? Any questions? Okay, what's next? Oh, a problem. Mhm. So let's go to the problem set. Excuse me. Chapter 5, problem 2. On this one, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. So let's look at the information they gave us. Okay, we see direct material cost. We see the labor cost per hour. So we're gonna have to multiply that by the number of labor hours, which is 90. Okay. Then we have manufacturing overhead is 150% of the direct labor cost. So to figure out the overhead cost, it's going to be whatever your labor cost is times 1.5, right? That would give you the overhead cost. And then we have some selling and administrative expenses listed here as well. So you're going to need all that information to answer these questions. What are the prime costs, conversion costs, total product costs, period costs, and then equivalent material cost per unit if we have 1,450 units. Okay, so go ahead, take 3 minutes or so to work on that. Break. So we know prime costs are the direct materials and the direct labor, right? And we had to calculate direct labor by saying 90 hours times $15.50. 105, no. 90 hours times 1550, that looks better, plus the material costs, that gives us our prime costs, right? 2,845. Labor costs plus material costs. Then conversion. For conversion, we have to know the overhead, and it says that overhead is 150% of direct labor. So the direct labor was $13.95 times 1.5. That gives us our overhead costs, which we could then just add to the direct labor to get our total conversion costs, $3,487.50. And I know what some of you are thinking. We could have just multiplied the labor costs by 2.5 and gotten the conversion costs. That would have worked in this case. Did I get the right number there? Okay. And then our total product cost, well, we could just take that conversion cost we just calculated and add materials, right? That would be the easiest thing to do at this point. So our total product cost, $4,937.50. Period costs, what did those come out to? 2,500. We just add the selling and administrative, and we get 2,500. Last question. If we produced 1,450 units, what would be the material cost per unit?
No.
$1, because it's also 1,450. So you just divide the cost by the number of units and you get $1 per unit. Okay, so those are the answers. Let's take our break. See you at 2:51.